Welcome back to the Line Podcast. My name is Aaron Alexander, and this is a place that we bring together the world's leading experts in all things health and wellness to help you optimize your mind, body, and movement. Today's gorgeous conversation is with my new friend, Connor Beaton. Connor is the author of Men's Work. He is the founder of ManTalks, and he is one of the world's preeminent experts on men's work, helping facilitate the journey of men back to their hearts, back to themselves, feeling on purpose, feeling open to intimacy, and things that are kind of some potentially fluffy language for some people. And the reality is men are hurting, men are lonely, and it's really valuable, I think, for men to be able to share more intimate, vulnerable aspects of themselves and be able to tap into their emotional well-being and be able to communicate and connect and grow. This conversation is very dynamic. We get into a lot around relationships, a lot around sexuality, a lot around polarity and dynamics between man and a woman, shadow work, how to tap into some of the parts that we might be uncomfortable within ourselves to touch on. But once we do, the way forward is through. And this conversation, I think, is very supportive for folks on their own internal journey. I want to also thank you guys for subscribing to this podcast, whether you're listening to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever, so you get each week's episodes. And also deep thanks to anyone leaving us reviews. I read every one, and it really is gratifying to hear your guys' perspective on the podcast. That is it. That is all. Let's get to it with my guy, Connor Beaton. Connor Beaton.
Yes, sir.
I like that name.
Thank you. I do too.
Not Connor Beating It, based off of your perspective on pornography.
No
more Connor Beating It. We don't do that.
That's right. I used to, that was it. In elementary, it was like Connor beats off.
Oh yeah.
And then I just went with it, and I did like the Russian accent. It's like, yes, I'm Connor Beatonov.
Oh, I like that.
It just went for it. It was when GoldenEye was around. Remember GoldenEye, like Nintendo 64?
I went hard on GoldenEye.
Oh yeah. I was king. I was champion.
Are dudes beating off too much? What's going on? What's our relationship to masturbation? Is there a healthy version of masturbation? How do we do this?
Absolutely.
How do we get involved in a healthy fashion?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time. Like, jokes aside, it's a very interesting time to be alive, right? If you're a 15-year-old boy or 35-year-old man, I mean, you can consume more pornographic content within the span of an hour than 99.99999% of men will have ever seen in their entire lifespan in the entirety of human history. Right? So I think that there's a lot of literature around it. It's there's some interesting research. It's kind of challenging, but I think it's challenging for a lot of young men. I think it's challenging for a lot of guys, where porn is a good escape route from the banality of everyday life, of the bullshit that we're dealing with, of the challenges. It's a good tool to go to when you are pissed off with your partner or not getting the sex that you want or enough sex. It's a good way to hit the reset button on your body if you feel like shit, or you're anxious, or you're upset and you don't want to feel that way anymore, and you just want the dopamine to flood through your brain and your body. So I think it's a lot of things, and I think we're living through a kind of unintentional social experiment that is playing out real time in the population of young men in our society, and it started when I was a kid. I think I found porn when I was like 13, 14 years old. This is back in the day of dial-up though, right? So it was like line by line.
Oh, yeah. We used to jerk off under the railroad tracks. We had a couple pornos.
There you go.
Me and my bros.
What's interesting? Like, I've been leading men's work for a decade, and the amount of men who have found pornography outside is fucking mind-blowing.
Like in the nature?
Like porn magazines randomly in nature.
Oh, dude, we had a whole stash.
There you go. See? Yeah.
We would literally side by side whack off underneath a freaking railroad tracks in Rohrstown, Pennsylvania. That was like our thing.
I mean, what else do you have to do in Pennsylvania?
I would look forward. I would be anticipating the bell ringing from school so we could go whack up under the railroad tracks. That was my shit.
We really are going to have some ManTalks conversation today.
Oh yeah, we're going all the way in.
This is going to be it. Yeah,
we're all the way into the core.
Yeah, I mean, We just went straight
I want to
in.
go to the root of things.
Yeah, I want to go to the root. I mean, I think it's just a part of, it's part of like every young man's foray into puberty, right? It's like you go through puberty and all of a sudden you're getting fucking hard-ons on the bus because the bus is bouncing and your body's just like, oh, should I be hard right now? And in class, and I think a lot of guys just don't know what to do with that. I mean, I didn't know what to do with that. Nobody talked to me about sex growing up or pornography. It was like this new thing, having internet porn. And so, I think part of the concern for me is that young boys, some of the data is showing that young boys are starting to find porn between like 8 and 11, and so you just imagine like a 9-year-old watching hardcore, face fucking. And you're like, well, that's probably not good for that 9-year-old boy. That's going to do something to him psychologically and emotionally and spiritually, but more specifically sexually, it's going to do something to him. He's going to have certain expectations about what sex is going to look like or should look like, his performance. So I think it's a very interesting conversation. I think the problem that usually arises whenever I've seen the conversation around porn emerge, and I'd be curious to get your take on this, is that it sort of like dissolves into this moral conversation. Like, is porn good or is porn bad? And that seems to be par for the course for pretty much everything in our modern culture today. And I'm less interested in, is porn good or is porn bad? And I'm more interested in, if you're a man who doesn't want to watch porn but can't stop, what do you do? Because I think that that's the place where a lot of men are finding themselves. Or if you're a man who is opting to use pornography instead of bringing the fullness of his sexual appetite and energy into his relationship, maybe that's problematic, right? And so I think it's less about the moral conversation. It's more about the use case of porn, how it's being used, why it's being used, what we as men are using it for and when we're using it. Because there's a very complex relationship, I think, between our nervous system as men and pornography. Because I think a lot of guys, and again, myself included, I used to use porn as a means of just feeling better, of a kind of like pseudo regulation of my nervous system when I felt overwhelmed or stressed out or frustrated or lonely or bored, or just didn't know what to do. And it's like, well, just go jerk off and watch porn and you'll feel better.
Yeah.
And so I kind of outsourced this really important piece of regulation, of being able to, quote unquote, self-soothe, as the therapeutic field would call it, of being able to ground myself. And so that I think is the primary conversation. I think it's a distraction for a lot of men from the inner work of, how do I ground myself when I'm feeling shit that I don't know how to deal with?
Yeah. It seems like it's very rarely the thing. It's what's behind the thing. What's the intention behind the thing. So just observing two people having penetratory sex could be really beautiful. It's not like, it's like, oh my God, it's very sacred, actually. It's like one of the, it's like, maybe it's the most important thing that could possibly happen on the planet.
It's marginally important. Yeah. Yeah.
And so like, it's getting into what's the quote unquote shadow, use like Jungian speak, side of that versus what's like the totally healthy side of that. And so I wonder, from your perspective, if we were to unpack what's behind compulsive masturbation or compulsive anything, compulsive drug use, compulsive cell phone observation, compulsive porn intake, like, but porn specific. What if we were to unpack the layers behind that? Let's go deeper with compulsive porn consumption.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple threads that sort of play into this. One is our sense of belonging. I think that, when we don't feel like we belong in a relationship or in a system, a family system or a friend circle, that we look for a place of belonging. And it's, I think for some people, porn becomes this sort of illusionary, like fabricated place, fantasy place where they can feel like they belong, right? Like if you're a 23-year-old guy and you're having problems, getting a date, which a lot of young men are today, right? It's like 27% of men between the ages of 18 and 29 haven't been sexually active in a year or more or ever. 66% of young men between that same age bracket, 18 and 29, are single. It's like one of the highest rates of young men that have been single ever. And so if you don't feel like you can find a place to belong in dating with women, you can go find it in porn. You can go and find an OnlyFans girl who kind of fits your bill of what you're looking for in a woman, and you can pay for it. And you can find a sense of belonging. And that feeds into this compulsive nature, because belonging is a primary need. It is a fundamental, foundational need for us as human beings. We need to feel like we belong. And when we don't feel like we belong somewhere, we just do all kinds of wild and crazy shit to fabricate and create a sense of belonging. So I think that for me is sort of at the foundational core of it, which maybe sounds wildly spiritual and esoteric. But I think outside of that is sabotage. And I think the misconception, and I've talked about this once or twice before, but I think the misconception about sabotage is that you sabotage to be out of control. And that couldn't be the furthest thing from the truth. You don't sabotage to be out of control. You sabotage because when you sabotage, you are looking to be in control. If you think about the ways in which you sabotage, the things that you normally go to are very known to you. The pattern is very known. The cycle is very known. So if you're using pornography to sabotage the sexual intimacy or connection in your relationship, right? That pattern, that cycle is going to be something that's probably played out in your life for a very long time. It's probably something that you're very familiar with. You know how you're going to feel before, you know how you're going to feel during it, you know the type of porn you're going to watch, like the video that you're going to get off to, right? Like you kind of know the whole thing. You know how you're going to feel afterwards. And so impulse control and not having impulse control, specifically around sabotage, is that we are seeking a sense of being in control when we're probably feeling very out of control in our lives. So I think for a lot of men who are, they're sabotaging their sex life, or, they're turning to pornography, it's often because they're looking for a sense of, I just need to fucking feel in control in my life. When I feel out of control with the fact that I don't know what I want to do with my career, I fucking hate my job, my wife and I aren't getting along, I have 4 kids and they all want my attention, and I don't know if I'm doing a good job as a parent. Like when life sort of infringes on the average human being, on the average man, and he feels very out of control in his life, he's going to turn to things that feel as if he has some semblance of influence over them. And so we sabotage to be in control, because our brain is a pattern recognition machine, and it will always, always, always defer to patterns that it knows, even when those patterns are abusive, unhealthy, and unwanted. We will still turn to the things that we don't want, simply because that's known to our brain. And our brain will always choose that, because going into the unknown is a territory that the brain can't map. So if you are somebody who normally uses pornography at the end of the day just to go to sleep, and every time that you try to not watch pornography to go to sleep, you're met with, I don't know what this feels like. This is a very strange thing. And I don't, I feel uncomfortable and I feel like I can't go to sleep. Like, these are the guys that I've worked with over the years. And they're like, I just can't bear the sensation of the unknown, the feeling of the unknown. Mm. So oftentimes those two pieces, sabotaging to be in control and looking for a place of belonging, are what I've seen to be the undercurrent of it, or the behind the scenes. What would you say? Because obviously it sounds like you've had a relationship with porn as well. Masturbating under the bridge.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Where was it? Scranton, or where was it?
Roarstown.
I'm Canadian, so I don't know the.
Oh yeah, we used to play hockey in Canada. We go to nice. Kitchener.
You defenseman?
Outside center. That's the old position.
You were a center?
Oh yeah.
You're a huge center.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's my perspective on what? Like why dudes are compulsively whacking
it? On what's behind the compulsive use of porn.
Well, Well, I mean, there is just like the roller coaster addictive pattern of it, where you're, from like a neurochemical perspective, you're getting this peak of dopamine and the other correlating neurochemicals, and then you're going below baseline. So it's kind of like an opiate addiction. And when you're actually connecting with real human beings in the forms of friendships, dinners, like meaningful conversations, sexuality, going out on a date, eventually getting to like the perhaps, peak experience of like, oh my God, we're actually intimate with each other.
Yeah.
There's so much self-regulation and co-regulation that's infused into that process of, we went and we played Frisbee together and we walked each other's dog or whatever, and we got dinner and we connected and we looked into each other's eyes and we shared vulnerable parts of ourselves, and we and we had this beautiful reflection back and forth, and I made you feel safe and you made me feel safe and I made myself feel safe, and wow, like there's so much regulation baked into that.
Yeah.
To finally get to this point of, oh, and now we're also physically intimate. If you strip away all the nutrients from that experience and you just get to the crescendo of like, slamming bodies together, at least like taking in the image of it, it would end up lending itself to becoming an addictive behavior.
Yeah.
But behind that, I think, is just a general lack of fulfillment, and probably a seeking of community and a seeking of a feeling like a yearning for connection, I think is really what's at the root of it.
Yeah.
I yearn for I want a hug.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I would agree with that entirely. And I think, you and I were in the sauna talking about like the cocaine, not cacao.
Oh yeah. Coca leaf. Yeah.
The cocoa leaf and cocaine analogy. And that's kind of the same thing. It's like, there's a sacredness and a utility to the plant. But when you just extract it and sort of put it down to this powder, suddenly it takes on a very different form. And I think that analogy could actually be used for pornography, sex versus pornography. And you do kind of strip mine out the intimacy of it and all these important pieces. And I think porn is just, it's like, again, this isn't to knock it. I'm not trying to say like anybody listening to this, like, you should never watch porn. Because I think that it gets interpreted like that often, and we can become very defensive. And I genuinely don't care if people watch porn or not. I don't think it's, good, bad, or otherwise. I think it's just about your usage of it. And the knowledge that, one, porn is entertainment. It just is. Like, if you talk to anybody that's been in the porn industry, they'll tell you it's entertainment. And two, it's a low risk, high reward system. Whereas relationships are the inverse of that. They're high risk and sometimes low reward, but sometimes very high reward. And in order for them to be high reward, we have to put in effort and we have to put in time. And all of these things have to play out that are very valuable to us, especially as men, because curating intimate relationships with women is challenging. It is hard. And so there's immense value in doing that. Whereas there's this very false sense of security and confidence and all of these pieces that can arise, with pornography, where you feel like, oh, there's, I don't have to put in a lot of effort, and all of a sudden there's this high reward. I get to get off whenever I want, or maybe you're paying people online to do things that you want them to do. And so there's this perception that you have a certain level of mastery or control. And then all of a sudden you're in person with somebody in real life and you realize that there's not a lot of skill that you possess. And so I think that's the frustrating part that I've also seen a lot of men grappling with, is that they actually want a deep level of sexual mastery. I think that's what most of us want, right? We want to have a deep level of proficiency and confidence within the realm of sex and sexuality, and intimacy. And porn can give you the illusion that you're partaking in a certain kind of sexual mastery, but you're actually on the outside looking in versus being on the inside, participating in the creation of that intimacy.
Yeah, it's like you're eating the menu instead of the meal.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, actually. I like that. I like that. Yeah.
So for a person that's feeling like they have like this vacuous longing sensation within them that's unidentifiable, it's nebulous, it's kind of just like, I don't know what I want or what my purpose is, but I know that's more than this.
Yeah.
you know, and I think the person in that disposition, which is a lot of people, it's me on occasion, there would be a tendency perhaps of wanting to suppress that sensation. And there's also a path towards actually leaning into it and learning more about it. Does that make sense? And if so, how does one start to unpack those kind of uncomfortable, maybe like nagging low level anxieties, or, you know, knots in your stomach, or like, I want more.
Yeah.
You know, because the world that we live in, like the Nerf reality that modern people live in, where you just kind of, it's fucking sad.
Yeah.
You know, like to come from where we came from, like if you look at like Native American culture, for example, you know, or Vikings or whatever, not to romanticize anything from the past, because there's probably a lot of effed up stuff too. But, you know, hunting and gathering and building shelter and rites of passage and, you know, all of that. It's like, it's compared to, I sit in a cubicle for 9 hours a day, and then I go have a microwave, you know, in 2 minutes meal with processed whatever food. And then I sit in front of the Netflix and I watch some other people's lives on TV. And then I take some medication to fall asleep. And then I, you know, wake up and do it all over again until I die. Like, good God.
Yeah.
How could you not want to suppress?
Yeah.
You know, like there's this like animal, like ferocious thing inside that wants to come out. I think particularly with men and women, I think it's a little bit different, but men, like, we want to fight.
Yeah.
You know, we want to have purpose, and we want to go. We want danger. We want to almost die.
Yeah. It's true.
We want to save somebody. We need a damsel.
It's true. I remember like
where are the damsels?
I rode motorcycles for like a decade, and it was this weird, you know, some of it was unhealthy in some ways, but I loved that feeling. You know, it was like driving 320 kilometers an hour.
You're an inch away from death the whole time.
Yeah, you're just like right on that edge, right? But there is something within our sort of like the masculine essence or masculine psyche, or within us as men biologically, that does want to push our edge. And I mean, if you look from an evolutionary standpoint, I mean, we have literally spent tens of thousands of years doing exactly that. I mean, every time, you know, you would go out to hunt, there was a possibility that you weren't coming back. You know, and so there's an edge right there, just baked into how you live life as a man for a very long time. Same thing if going to war, right? You go to the war, you don't know if you're coming back. And so there's this edge that a lot of men have lived with, you know, historically and from an anthropological standpoint, that just doesn't exist within some of our lives today.
And every time you would go to war, I'd imagine you'd go through some process of, you know, I've heard if you die before you die, then you can like truly let go and begin to live. Yeah,
which is a spiritual
like paraphrasing,
process.
You know, other people have said that in various iterations.
Yeah.
But if every time you go, okay, there's a war, you're like, you probably go through some rituals and such, and you essentially go through this ego death.
Yes.
And imagine the liberation and freedom, not glorifying war, not glorifying like any of it, but the freedom and liberation potentially. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I've never gone to war. I'm very soft, you know, but I've at least visually gone through it. And, you know, before going certain things, before doing ayahuasca or before doing a darkness retreat, I've kind of had sensations of like, I kind of feel like a part of me might die on this. And you go through this practice of, in a sense, almost like dying before you die.
Yeah.
And that's something that it seems valuable to be able to live a more fulfilled life, or perhaps to maybe quell some of those inner anxieties, I would think. Yeah.
Well, I think what you're talking about is the one of the core functions of initiation, which we've strip mined out of culture in Western society, right? Like the core principle of initiation. Richard Rohr, who's this wonderful Franciscan monk, has this great quote where he says, unless a man goes on a journey of powerlessness, he will always abuse power. And so we as men, we're always kind of grappling with our sense of power. How do we use it? We can feel that there's a sort of potency within us, but we don't necessarily know what to do with it. And so initiation is meant to create an experience. And I think what you're talking about with, like, you know, the sitting in the dark for however many days, or Vipassana, like we were talking about, or ayahuasca, is that you kind of consciously know that you're about to go through an experience where you're going to be put in a position where you are powerless, where some external force, life, ayahuasca, the dark, silence, is going to put you in a position of you not being able to conquer, you not being able to defeat, you not being able to dominate, where you have to reconcile with being in a position of powerlessness. And so I think that a lot of young men today, when we don't have those initiatory processes, one, there's no demarcation of like, when have you become a man? Like one of the questions I always ask at our men's weekends is, what was the day that you became a man? Mm-hmm. What was the day? And for the majority of men, they're like, I have no idea.
What about for you? Are you a man?
I mean, for me, part of it was becoming a father. Right. For me, part of it was the rock bottom that I experienced. And I think unfortunately, not to glorify hitting rock bottom, but I think unfortunately when we don't have proper initiations where elders are bringing us through these rites of passage, what we as men do is we create rock bottoms in our life, right, so that we just fucking tank and destroy everything. We put ourselves in an unintentional position of powerlessness to see, who will I become on the other side of this? Can I fight my way up? Can I rise after self-destruction? And if I can, then I've proved something about who I fucking am as a man. You know, can I go into the cave and confront the dragon, right, as Jordan Peterson would talk about, and see who I really am when I meet the beast that's inside of me. And so I think that was a big one. And then I think the other one for me, the major one, was sitting with an elder. You know, I've been very fortunate to have 3 really crucial elders in my life who have played a role in ushering me into a more mature version of a man. And, you know, I would say arguably one of the most important conversations I had with my first mentor was after I hit rock bottom and I lived out of the back of my car for a few weeks. I didn't want anybody to know what I had done. You know, I had been lying, I'd been cheating, and I'd been abusing substances. Like I'd been a grade A asshole, you know, like I really.
Cheating on your girlfriend?
Yeah. Yeah. And
I would like to talk about infidelity as well.
Sure.
So I'd love to unpack, like, why were you cheating? Why do men cheat? Why is that a thing?
Yeah.
What? And I'd like to learn more about your rock bottom.
Is this for your feminine whispering podcast?
Oh yeah. Yeah. We're going to start a sister podcast to ManTalk called The Feminine Whisperer.
It'll blow up
or something like that.
It'll be huge.
Oh, is it Whispering with the Feminine?
I can't remember what it was, but it was good. As soon as you said it, I was like, that's good.
Yeah.
But you know, I was sitting with my mentor at one point and he, you know, I really felt like I was broken, and I really felt like there was something fundamentally wrong with me. You know, I kept fucking up. I couldn't get my life together. You know, I kept hurting the people that I loved. And we started having this conversation. I said, you know, I don't even know why you have agreed to work with me. You know, because I was apprenticing with him and he was teaching me about Jungian psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy and Buddhism and Zen and Taoism. And it was very confronting for me because I didn't feel like I deserved any of that elderhood. You know, I didn't feel like I deserved any of that. And he said to me, you know, sometimes, Connor, we all need somebody to believe in us more than we believe in ourselves. And I just remember like breaking down, and became very emotional because it was this thing that I had felt from him for so long. It was like this masculine presence in my life that was immovable, you know? And I got very clearly in that moment that there was nothing that I could do that man wouldn't have a kind of deep love and respect for me. You know, he might set boundaries with me. He might not work with me. He might, you know, do a bunch of things, but I got reverence in that moment. And I think that in that moment and in that relationship, I was able to receive this kind of nourishment of what it meant to be a mature man.
I think something that's valuable, like I've attended some AA meetings and also whatever it's called, SA, like sex addiction. I'm going to like a bunch of the different AA related meetings.
Just out of curiosity or for...
I mean, I've got all sorts of compulsive addictive behaviors. I think they're all kind of like relatives. You know, it's general void filling, avoidant patterns.
There's GF.
Yeah, exactly. GFA. I just started a new one.
Yeah, there you go. The GFA program, general void.
But there's something I think, quite supportive about being in those groups, because the cultural trend, the cool thing to do and be in that is to be at rock bottom,
right?
And to be vulnerable,
yeah,
and to be in a place where it's like, I don't know anything. I've effed everything up. I've ruined all my relationships. I tried to end my life. I couldn't even do that right.
Yeah,
like, take the wheel, Jesus.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, they're like, to be in that place. You can also, I think, get wrapped up in that place where you gain maybe a little too much momentum in that, and you start patterning yourself of like,
yeah,
okay, you're not just a sinner. You're also a lot of other stuff too.
Yeah.
But to also have access to that place, I think it perhaps potentiates some level of like emotional plasticity of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
We were like, I'm really not in control. I'm not doing this right.
Mm-hmm.
I need help. That's a very meaningful place for a person to come into. And in a way, it's like a version of that dying before you die type situation.
Yeah.
You know, and so I wonder for you, do you have any sense of that? I've felt that way as well. I feel like eternally broken in a way. Like, I don't know where I'm broken or what it is, but like, I feel like there's something not right here.
Yeah.
What was that like for you? And how did you start to unpack that and come into a place of I don't know, integration, I guess you could say?
Yeah. I mean, I think for a very long time, I pursued the question of why do I feel like this? You know, and I think the rational mind wants to figure out a very clear answer to that question. You know, I think many of us feel like that in some way, shape, or form. And I, you know, could sort of point to things that had led to it. You know, my parents got divorced when I was 3. I witnessed their divorce. You know, it was heartbreaking. It's one of my first memories. My mom battled with alcohol, you know, so child of an alcoholic, you know, all those types of pieces. Had a deep, you know, I lived with my mom growing up and had a deep yearning to spend more time with my father, because I only, you know, saw him once or twice a month. And there was this kind of void that started to grow within me in his absence. And so, you know, I could point to any number of those things, but I think what I've learned over the years is that why we feel that void is less relevant than what that experience is actually like. And, you know, we can look at some of the traumas or the abuses that we've experienced, and we can say like, oh yeah, that is what created this wounding that I, you know, carry, this void or this numbness that I feel. But that answer is actually less relevant than the impact that the experience had and how we begin to carry that wound within us. And I think that is part of the process. Like for me, I started to get very curious about how do I actually become a steward to this part of myself, you know, that I begin to tend to this wound, you know, much like a soldier has gone out on the battlefield and maybe has come back missing a limb. He's going to need to rehabilitate and tend to the part of himself that he lost. Mm-hmm. He's going to need to grieve that. You know, he's going to need to learn to move through the world in a different way. And I don't think that we often think about that in the same way when it comes to our psychological and emotional wounding. And so for me, it really was the question of how do I tend to this part of me? Because the framework that I normally would operate from, which I think a lot of us as men operate from, is like, how do I fucking kill this part off?
Right.
You know, like in my inner kingdom, I can feel that there's these parts of me that I don't like, right? My inner critic, this deep pain that I carry, sometimes this grief from X, Y, and Z, and the, you know, rage about something. And the natural response to that is like, how the fuck do I get rid of that? How do I exile it out of my inner kingdom? How do I kill it off? So that I don't have to deal with it or feel with it. And, you know, the sort of cliche with it is that we have to learn how to build a relationship to it. And so I finally came into a place where I began to prioritize learning how to build a relationship with my own pain. And that's like, you know, the first line of my book is that a man's work begins in pain, period. Because if you as a man aren't willing to turn towards your pain and start to understand it and start to learn how to tend to it and start to learn to tend to the man that you become when your pain becomes very inflamed and activated, like you're fucked, You know, it's like you can either learn how to deal with your anger, or the world will have to deal with it for you.
Or kids.
Or your kids will have to deal with it for you.
Or your next lifetime, depending on your belief system. It's like you either deal with this now, or in 10 years, 40 years, 80 years, or perhaps, depending upon your belief system, maybe 5 lifetimes from now.
Yeah, some other lifetime, right?
Who knows?
Yeah.
But let's just like stay more pragmatic. And it's like you do this now, or if you're lucky enough to have kids, your kids will have it.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Is that how it works?
Essentially, yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Because you're subconsciously, your child is a sponge.
100%.
So what an amazing responsibility to bring a new life into the world. Again, lots of things I don't know what the hell I'm talking about because I don't have a kid. But this is another thing I've visualized and explored, and you have experience with, so I can ask you. But my feeling is that level of accountability, of acknowledging, especially being a person like yourself that, writes, hosts men's work gatherings and write a book called Men's Work. And, it's all about unpacking your subconscious and all of those things. And the awareness that your child is picking up subconsciously every little detail of who you are. And like something that I experienced growing up, my dad was, he had some issues with like alcohol and things growing up. My mom had some things with like, she was kind of like a perfectionist of sorts. They had their own version of quote unquote trauma from their childhoods with their parents. And my sensation based off of therapy and different kind of like somatic experiences and such and introspection, is that at that time frame, I was clocking that or tracking that as you're not able to tend or be present within yourself and within your life, so you need to numb. And here I am, this like light in your world, and life is too heavy and you need to suppress and numb yourself. So when you're holding me and you're buzzed, not just buzzed because you're having a good time and you're having some wine with your wife or whatever, but like life is too much and you're suppressing.
Yeah.
And I would imagine a child could only receive that as some version of, oh, I must not be enough for you. I would think, or some iteration of that.
Yep.
And so like the sooner a person can start to go in and clean up those low level anxieties or fears or guilt or shames or anything that's holding you back from being like a what is you can call it, like an individuated person, like your full expressed self, before being a parent, I'd imagine would probably be really good for your kid.
Yeah. And I think just to, say something on that, I love the way you articulated it, is like the aim isn't perfection.
Yeah.
The aim is a deeper sense of wholeness.
Yeah.
And to have a better relationship with the self. And, there's some great work by a gentleman named Dr. John Barry, who I believe is in Scotland or the UK. I can't remember exactly where his institute is. But I mean, he's done a bunch of research to find, what's the primary motivator and driving factor for men that actually allows us to have a deep sense of fulfillment. And what he's found is that a constant pathway or commitment to self-development is one of the most richly rewarding things that we can do, because we, like in the book, I talk about our relationship to women in one point. And we as men, we get very externalized. So we can very quickly focus on the woman, right? I got to figure her out. I got to solve her problems. Like, what does she need? What does she want? And we can lose our sense of self very quickly in a relationship.
Like a deflection device.
Yeah, deflection, projection onto them, and we can sort of offload our sense of well-being, happiness, validation onto the women that we're with, in a way where we completely miss ourselves. And the women that we date aren't the journey. They're not the adventure. They're not the exploration. It's actually us, right? Our personal psyche, psychology, our ethics, our morals, right? When we can begin to turn towards and move away from this externalization of trying to figure out problems out in the world and solve the people that we're around and make sure that everything's right for them, and we can begin to turn that lens of consciousness and awareness, fold it back in on ourselves and say, what what are my ethics? What are my morals? What are my values? What really matters to me? What's the adventure that I need to go on in my own life, whether that's, out in the world to go on an actual adventure, or to look at your own healing and development as a form of adventure. And when we can do that, so many of the requirements that we need to develop ourselves into spiritually expansive, pragmatically competent men will start to unfold. Who I was 12 years ago, it was so radically different than who I am today. And a lot of that is a result of me being able to turn the lens on myself and look at, what do I need to work on? How do I better myself? How do I, face some of my fears? How do I, be more honest and transparent with the men that are in my life, so that I have support, that I have a sense of community and belonging. And so starting to add in all of these pieces that are incredibly important.
Why is that so scary for people, for some people? And probably even if a person thinks it's not scary for them, there's probably some levels that they haven't observed yet with themselves, or haven't been available to observe yet. But there's some folks where it's like everything is about you.
Yeah.
Like you out, pointing outward.
Yeah.
So that victim mindset, which is now, coming into greater popularity in the last, I don't know, few years on social media at least.
Yeah.
Identifying like all of the ways that I am a victim.
Yeah.
And that's like your calling card.
There's immense power in victimhood, right? Like there's an immense power in either feigning being the victim, or even, and this isn't victim blaming, like just to make it very clear, like I think that there are many people who have very truly been victimized and,
Sure.
Dealt with incredibly challenging things and gone through horrific things. But there's a way that victimhood can reorient power structures, especially relationally, right? If you feel like you've been ostracized or harmed or et cetera, you can wield that in a way where you can start to subtly manipulate and coerce other people into acting and behaving in the way that you want. And it can create a very clear illusion of safety and security. And when we're in a victim mindset, the thing that we want most is safety and security, right? We want to feel safe. We want to feel connected. We want to feel like we have a sense of tethering to the other. But it creates a false I-thou relationship, right? It creates an I-it relationship. So you no longer become a thou, which in Gestalt would be, the equivalent of, another version of you, I guess you could say, a humanized spiritual being. You become an object. And you become an object that I need to control in order to get my needs met. So I don't think that answers your initial question. That was like a little tirade on victimhood, because I think that's important.
Yeah.
But I lost the thread of what.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, just the initial question is the I don't know if I remember the initial question either, but the value, a person that is in the place where it just seems, I'm sure some folks perhaps could resonate with this within a romantic relationship, probably be the place would be most common to see this come up, and perhaps both partners feel like they're mutually, their other partner is doing this, and they're both kind of in this like monologue against each other. There's not really much of a conversation happening, but to be in the place of kind of consistent blaming, pointing out, compared to reorienting the operating system into an orientation of what's my role in this.
Yeah.
Like, is that a better operating system? Like how, like what's like in relationship, blaming, criticizing. It's like the John Gottman 4 Horsemen: contempt, blaming, criticizing, stonewalling.
Yeah, contempt, criticism, stonewalling.
If a person's in that orientation in their communication style, where it's all out, how do we start to rework that in a way that it starts to come into a place of mutual accountability, where we're actually mutually excited to look inward and excited to say, what is my role in this? As opposed to, you made me feel this way, you did this to me. How do we get into a place of, just greater responsibility, if that's even possible, a better direction or possible?
Yeah, I would certainly say it's a better direction, right? I mean, I think a couple of things. One, we have to prioritize connection and intimacy within the relationship. That connection becomes priority above disconnection. And unfortunately, many of us have been taught directly or indirectly to prioritize disconnection. You know, I think we wildly underestimate the power of modeling, what we see in our family system growing up. You know, if you see parents arguing nonstop, you know, they're constantly at each other, the likelihood that you're either going to just repeat that pattern in your relationship, or you're going to say, I'm going to live in opposition of this. I don't want to be anything like them. I'm going to live in opposition of that entirely. And so what do? You never engage in conflict, right? You just don't bother getting angry or setting boundaries or doing anything that's going to create disconnection. And so you start to acquiesce and fawn and do all of these maladaptive things to try and maintain the illusion of connection, but intimacy never gets to sort of penetrate.
People pleaser or a simp. I like simp.
Yes, simp. Yeah.
I like simp.
That's so good. Yeah.
How about that?
That's going to be the title, right, of this episode.
Oh, yeah,
how
for
not
sure.
to simp in life.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, I think in many ways, almost all of us at some point in our development will have had to trade some form of integrity or authenticity for a sense of belonging, whether that's in school, whether that's at home, whether that's with friends, whether that's with people that we're attracted to. And so we kind of have to start to undo that modality, you know, and you know, how do you sell that to people? I mean, I think you kind of have to come to that notion on your own that the way you're doing things is just not workable. And I think everybody knows that at some point, right? But like, it really does have to come from a place of ownership. Like Jung said that the first step in any therapeutic process, any spiritual process, any religious process, any process of change is admission. It's confession. And so at the very least, you have to be willing to admit and confess to yourself, like, the way that I'm doing things is not working, you know, otherwise nothing else can go on. And then be willing to look at what might I be trading for a sense of security, safety, connection within this relationship, right? Am I not expressing my anger? Am I not putting boundaries in place in my relationship? Am I withholding certain truths about what I want sexually? You know, so you have to start to sort of mine for what is it that I'm not bringing into this relationship that would actually allow me to feel fully connected and fully online and vibrant with this other person. And then, you know, you have to acknowledge that there's probably a risk in that. I think a lot of people have been, you know, in the last 30 years, I would say, wildly domesticated and taught to become risk avoidant and risk averse. And so even these micro things of, oh, I have this fantasy in my relationship. I really wanted to do this role play, or I wanted to fuck in this certain place, or, you know, I want to feel this way sexually in my relationship with my wife, or, you know, with my husband or whatever. Those types of things seem far too risky, because in the background is this noise of like, well, what if I get rejected? What if they don't want that? You know, what if I get denied or I get abandoned again, right? If I bring this forward and suddenly it's this huge discrepancy and this person leaves me. And so we have to be willing to face the fear of rejection in order for change to be possible. Like one of the things that I wrote about in the book is like, there is no change without confrontation. Period.
Yeah.
There's no change without confrontation. And so we have to muster the courage to confront the things within our lives that almost feel a little bit overwhelming.
It's a workout. It's a hermetic stress.
Yeah.
There's no change in your physical structure and your musculoskeletal structure without exercise.
Right. Yes.
So if you're just like, wow, man, this just feels good. I'm just here. We're just chilling. This feels good.
Yeah.
It's like, that's okay, but you're going to suffocate on yourself.
Yeah.
You need to do something hard at some point if you want to create change, which would be the confrontation.
And resistance isn't bad, right? So, you know, it's like, what's the conversation you need to have in your relationship or with your friends? What's the sort of truth that you need to admit, you know, that you've been avoiding or rejecting in your dynamic, whether that's sexually or whatever, that maybe you or maybe it's with a friend, maybe it's with a family member, maybe it's just with yourself about work or whatever it is. But being willing to confront that truth, I think, is one of the very first steps that we all need to take.
Why is infidelity so common?
Oh, I think I really love Esther Perel's sort of work on this. She and I have chatted a number of times on this because she's very interested in the work that we as men are starting to take on culturally. And so, I think in many ways, and this is maybe a little controversial, I'm not too sure, but I think in many ways, evolution has built us to have sort of opposing mating preferences, right? And so we as men, we want to have many, many sexual partners for a lot of reasons that are biological and evolutionary. And so, but conversely, a lot of women are really looking for, from a foundational place, commitment. And so, one of the things that I've said before is, like, women are the gatekeepers of sex and men are the gatekeepers of commitment. And so when you look at it, the dating and mating structures that women are always trying to evoke commitment from men. How much time will you spend with me? How much love will you give to me? How much attention and care, and all of these things that are signals of a deeper level of commitment. And, there's a number of reasons for that. But then on the other side, we as men are always looking for a sense of sexual openness and commitment through sex and intimacy, because we all know it's a very challenging thing for us to procure, right? So it's very challenging for most women to procure commitment from a man, especially a man who is good in his own life. He's got good friends, he's got a good career, he's elevating himself, he's doing inner work, he's doing all these things. Women know that it's challenging to procure that. And so when we get into a relationship, it's not like these competing things just vanish, these competing desires just vanish. And so they start to butt heads. And then you layer on top of that things like childhood trauma, the differences in our family systems, the commentary that you probably heard as a kid around sex and intimacy, the shame and the baggage that you might be bringing into a relationship because of, religious commentary around sex and intimacy that has convinced you that, you shouldn't express yourself sexually in a certain way in a relationship. And so there's all of these social, biological, cultural impediments that start to work their way into a relationship and make it very challenging for people to be fully sexually open and fully sexually expressed, and to have a kind of continuity where that's at the forefront of the relationship, and that it's prioritized in a way that both people feel like they're being nourished and connected to, and that their desires are being met. And so I think that it's wildly complex. Why is infidelity so common? I think there's a lot of reasons for this. And, I think there's many people that have done a good amount of research. Esther Perel talks about this a lot. I think my take on it is that a couple things. One, again, we all want to have a sense of belonging, and we want to feel like we fit in somewhere. We want to feel like we belong somewhere. And so if we're going through a period in our relationship or our marriage or whatever it is, where we don't feel like our needs are being met in that space, we start to feel like we don't belong in that place, in that relational dynamic. And so what do? We start to consciously or unconsciously open the doors for where might I belong, or maybe not even all of me, but where might this part of me belong, this part of my sexual desire, this role play, or this fantasy that I want to experience and explore, where might this part of me belong? And so the real challenge is bringing the fullness of who we are and what we want into a monogamous relationship, right? And I think that in our traditional forms of monogamous relationships, they're just riddled with bullshit. You know, again, religious, societal, gender-based expectations of what things should look like and how they should go. And so, you know, we just have this tremendous amount of shit and garbage that has entered into our sexual bedroom that we kind of have to clean out in order for us to prioritize the intimacy between two people. Because otherwise, you know, with the rise of online dating and internet apps and, you know, just sex apps, I mean, you can go and get whatever fantasy you want pretty much met at any given time. So I think that there's a lot of conflicting pieces that play into this. Maybe I'll speak from a personal standpoint because I think that might help to contextualize some of this. So, you know, one of the things that was hard for me to write about in the book was infidelity, because I cheated in almost every relationship that I was in. And it was one of my deepest form of shame of who I was. You know, I had really hurt a lot of the women that I had dated. And
they always find out?
Yeah. Yeah, they all knew.
I think there's something to wanting to be caught with things.
For
I think
sure.
it's like some Peter Levine stuff, like Awakening the Tigers. He gets into a lot of different examples of that. Yeah. I think that's how that book's called, Awakening the Tiger.
Awakening the Tiger, yeah.
Yeah. Where your subconscious wants to heal your toxic waste within you. Yeah. You know, like the body, mind, heart, all the systems. They're seeking homeostasis. And if you have some clenched bracing pattern somewhere in there, it's pretty much continually trying to work its way out. And it'll work its way out in an argument, it'll work its way out because you got arrested for doing a thing, it'll work its way out because your girlfriend busted you for cheating on her or whatever, and then suddenly you're like, and then therapy and all the things. Yeah. But all of those, I think, are little flares, or trying to be seen, those parts within you. Yeah. And it creates trouble in your life. It seems like the sooner the person can start to just be open to the investigation and the accountability of like, what's within me, the sooner you could start to, you know, probably avoid some of those F-ups, you know? Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, sometimes infidelity is a sign that there's something missing in the relationship, that it has gone sideways, right? A couple has grown apart. There's a lack of communication. You know, there's certain desires and intimacies that are being brought forward. But there's also something within the person who is being unfaithful, right? And so it's never just that one individual. I think one of the things that's very important is that whenever infidelity has happened in a relationship, both people have a part to play, you know, especially when it comes to the breakdown within the relationship. But for the person who has been unfaithful, you know, I think in many ways for myself, like sex became a place where I just started getting attention as a young man. And I didn't feel very good about who I was as a young man. And I didn't feel very good about my capacities for much. You know, I was pretty average at everything, but I felt like I was very good at getting attention from women, especially sexually. And so it became this kind of drug of validation, and it was very interconnected to my sense of self-worth. And so when I felt shitty about who I was, or I felt shitty about what was happening in my life, or I felt lost or directionless or whatever it was a good place for me to go in order to get some ego boost and feeling of like self-worth and empowerment, and you know, not in a necessarily healthy way or in integrity, but it was a way for me to get that hit of validation and worth that I hadn't developed a framework in myself to give that to myself. Yeah, it's like I've never learned how to actually, or felt safe to love myself, which again is one of those diluted, like cliche things to say that I'm like almost like, oh, I can't believe I'm saying fucking love myself on the podcast. And there's legitimacy to it if you do unpack deep enough. Maybe not everybody, but for me at least, a point where it's like, oh yeah, like that feels uncomfortable. There's like a deep internalized shame in there. And if you can find someone else in the periphery to validate and say like, no, you're actually pretty good. Yeah. I'd like to sleep with you. You're like, all right, like we're good. I'm good for 5 days. Yeah. Well, and I think
we're all right. I think the other thing, one of the things that'd be maybe interesting for us to touch on is like what's called the Madonna whore complex. Have you ever? Yeah, you heard that. Yeah. So that was very much,
but explain.
Yeah. So the Madonna whore complex is essentially like you get in a relationship with a woman who you deeply love and respect, and you turn her into the archetype of the Madonna, right? This sort of pure, loving being who you sort of pedestal and idolize and respect. And you begin to slowly separate the ability to see her as the quote unquote archetype of the whore, right? So this very primally sexual being that can be the sort of vessel of your sexual desires. And so what ends up happening is that you separate, and you begin to separate women into those two categories. And that's certainly something, and there's a number of reasons why this can happen, right? You can have had a really loving mother and you sort of saw her in a very specific way. And so that, you attract women that maybe remind you of her in some capacity, right? Their love, their gentleness, their softness, etc. And so the idea of bringing your more primal sexual energy to that woman that you're in love with feels like you're tainting her in some way. It feels like you're degrading her or disrespecting her in some capacity, rather than it being a true, authentic expression of your love, of your sexual desire manifest through the heart. And so, which maybe sounds a little bit woo-woo for some folks that are out there, but one of the things that I've noticed in many men is that this Madonna whore complex is very active, especially within the nice guy, and so that was me to a T. I started to date these women that I really loved, and I thought that they were so wonderful, and it was like the more that I fell in love with them, the less capable I felt of bringing my sexual energy, the true version of how I wanted to show up in the bedroom, to them. And so this split started to happen where the women that I would cheat with were the archetype of the whore. Like, I didn't want to date them. I didn't want to be with them.
Sure.
I didn't want to fall in love with them. I just wanted to fuck them. And it was a very specific energy, but it was missing that love. And so there was this yearning and longing for me of like, I want to merge those two things. I want to bring those two things together. And so I had to do a good amount of work on understanding like what is going on within me that is causing me to separate women into these sort of two categories and not be able to bring the sort of full expression of my sexual desire and sexual power and potency into the women that I really love. And what I started to realize was that was incredibly, incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah.
It felt so fucking confronting. For all the reasons that I talked about before, what if my view of her changes, and the woman that I thought is just like this loving, pure being, all of a sudden I look at her a different way. And I saw that as a bad thing rather than an expansive version of seeing who she is.
You probably don't accept your quote unquote shadow, and therefore simultaneously you're not able to accept her and hers.
That's right. Yeah. So I had discarded my sort of like sexual desires.
You're fragmented internally, therefore you're fragmented within the relationship.
Within the relationship. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so,
you're like visualizing like Santa Claus with his satchel, satchel like shadow presence.
Black
You just shovel them off to other gals.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, you.
Yeah. And so, over time in dating women that I really loved, I started to bring that part of me online and to risk saying, here's what I want to explore, and here's what my sexuality really looks like, and here's how I want to feel in the bedroom, and here's the type of role plays that I want to experience, and here's how I desire to show up sexually within our interactions. And doing that was wildly confronting, but also started to bring those two parts of me together and started to teach me that it was okay to express this part of me, and that the women that I loved were willing to receive that part of me. And it was very healing in a lot of ways.
It also liberates them and grants them permission to be able to go deeper within themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it was this wonderfully in many ways, sort of spiritual endeavor of getting to bring the I think we all have a sort of dark side to our sexuality, and getting to bring that into my relationship. And so I think that we're all sort of craving this, because sex is this beautiful place where the true depths of our being can begin to emerge. Our shadow, our relationship with power, our relationship with powerlessness, all of those things can begin to emerge in that space. Our relationship to just being in the moment, right? Not needing to necessarily do anything, but just being in the moment and sort of playing with energy and playing with a person's, essence and their sexual arousal, and being so tuned in to what's happening in their body and their breath and the whole thing. And so it's been a wonderful journey. And I had somebody ask me, like, do you wish that you had, didn't have to go through all the infidelities? And I was like, I don't know if I would have learned
no other way.
Any other way.
So painful. You'd be so ashamed.
Yeah.
That you just feel like a complete, you're like in the dirt. It's all Christian stuff / lots of other religious ideologies. Like, you need to be on your knees in order to change.
Yeah. And
if you're still kind of like, okay, like one knee, it's like, no.
Yeah.
Both knees.
Both.
All the way down.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but I mean, like, even that kind of dynamic can show up, in the bedroom. And so it's been a very interesting journey. And I think for a lot of couples, like my wife and I work with a lot of couples because she's a marriage and family therapist. And sex is just one of those places where it's the intersection for all the challenges that a couple is having. Communication problems, boundary problems, all of it shows up in sex. All of it sort of filters into how a couple will do sex and what gets in the way of sex. And so, one of the most sort of fun things that I like to do when working with a couple is like, tell me exactly what's going on in your sex life. Like, let's just start there. What does it look like for you? Where are you satisfied? Where are you dissatisfied? Where do you feel resistance?
What's the most common themes you hear in dissatisfaction?
I mean, generally guys will say that the common thing of like, I don't feel like we have sex enough. Sometimes that can be the female partner, for sure. I'm not saying that it's exclusively men, but that's one of the biggest dissatisfactions. And then, there's comments about the length and the duration of sex. That's also a major discrepancy between couples, that one person is wanting to have sex a lot longer than the other person. And that can be because that person doesn't want to go for that long, or, it's uncomfortable, or they can't, right? Or can't is, in loose terms. So that's a big one. And then there's the why of why have sex in the first place? Like, what role does sex play in the relationship? And I think that's a fundamental place that all couples need to begin with. It's like, what role and what purpose does sex have for you individually in the relationship? And what role and what purpose does sex have in the relationship for your partner? Because if you see sex as the vessel for spiritual expansion and actualization, and your partner's like, well, it's just a place for me to
bust a nut.
It's like, that's a pretty big fucking discrepancy. It's like you're just speaking in different languages. You're in different countries. You're exploring very wildly different territories. Yeah. And so just the fundamental question of like, what is the role that sex plays in a relationship, and what purpose do you want it to play? And so that can, that sometimes can be a really great place for couples to start. And I would say the last thing is probably just how I would describe as like power dynamics within the relationship. Who wants to be leading the interaction and guiding it, and who wants to be opening themselves to the experience of like where it's going to go, and not necessarily that either person knows where it's going to go, but be on the sort of receiving end of being led through positions, through different dynamics, through, certain types of communications or role plays or places where intimacy happens or when it happens. Like that that I think is very important as well, because I think it was Oscar Wilde that said, everything in life is about sex, except for sex. Sex is about power. And I think that holds very true. And that's why sex becomes the intersection for everything in a relationship, because when a couple is going through a power battle, right, they're having disagreements, it shows up in their sex. And you can work through some of the things, some of the discrepancies that are happening in your relationship through sex. It's like, for guys, like post-nut clarity, it's a very real thing.
Yeah.
It's like, it's a very real thing. And so like the thing that you thought really fucking mattered, like the hill that you were dying on, the point that you were trying to fucking prove. And like, she has to understand that I'm right about this. And it's like, you fucking orgasm. You're like, oh, that doesn't matter at all. Like, I don't give a shit about that in the least.
Not a thing.
Right. And so I love that we just,
you got to. Can't be too serious.
No.
You gotta oscillate.
Yeah. What's your take on infidelity? And because it is very common, in our society, like, do you feel like it plays a certain role in an individual's life or within a couple's life that they're trying to figure something out outside of what I said?
I would echo most of what you said, honestly. Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I mean, it could just be like, there's obviously like the evolutionary psychological perspective of
like mate swapping and
and what is the ideal relationship container? Is it monogamous? Is it monogamish? Is it like some kind of version? Like, I don't actually know. It seems like in the culture that we live in, some version of monogamous to monogamish, whatever that means to you, is probably about appropriate. If it becomes polyamorous, which I don't know a lot about, but I know people that have been involved in that. I haven't seen a lot of long-term functioning polyamorous relationships, particularly once kids enter into the situation. Yeah, I think you can probably get away with a lot more without kids. I've heard you can like choose your work. What is it, like your work, your health, your girlfriend, and your kids, but you only get 3, something like that. Once you introduce kids into the situation, it's like, oh boy,
it
good luck
so much.
Incorporating another situation in there.
Yeah.
But I think it likely comes back to a lack of communication, and the lack of communication comes back into shame or fear of not being accepted. Yeah. And those lack or that fear of or shame of not being accepted for the way that you think and the way that you feel. There's a mutual accountability within the partnership there. That, like if both partners can be in that place where you feel so safe with that person that I know that I can share like the depths of myself, and I don't even know what I'm sharing. Like, I don't even know myself all the way. Like in this experience, I'm just here to grow, and like, that's our pact. And whatever I share, you're able to come from that place, not immediately from a place of judgment. And even if you do, I can then step back, and then I can hold the reins for a moment, and I can say, okay, I can be neutral around your judgment. Yeah. And we can kind of oscillate and pull each other back, because we're not going to just be like perfectly neutral all the time. No, but if you can have that dynamic where it's like, okay, sometimes I'm not going to be perfect, and I'm going to get reactionary, and I'm going to fall off for a moment, and I need you in that moment. Yeah. And sometimes you will, and I'll be there. But you have that, and the way that you would work through that would be through successfully making it through conflicts and developing deeper levels of trust and intimacy. And to be able to do that, it probably takes a lot of like emotional hygiene. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think relationships take a tremendous amount of work, and like Jung said that the fastest horse in the race of individuation or wholeness or integration is marriage or relationship, because our shadows come out in relationship. He said women stand at the very edge of what a man knows about himself. And women stand at the very beginning of where a man's shadows begins. And so all of our stuff comes up in relationship, and it becomes the place where we sort of fight out this spiritual, psychological, emotional battle for belonging. Not just who we think we are, but all the shit that we don't like about ourselves that also wants to be included in the conversation. Yeah. And so maybe I'll just wrap up the infidelity piece with, there's this, I gave a TED talk years and years ago, which I would do very differently today if I had to give the same talk, but there was this woman, and her name is escaping me right now, but she spoke, and she was a sex therapist. And I think she said
a line that stuck with me. I think I might have written it in the book, where she said, on average, in general, men cheat to stay and women cheat to leave. And so in 3 or 4 decades of working with couples in real time, what she started to realize was that men were having affairs, were cheating because there was something missing from the relationship, or there was something that they weren't bringing into the relationship. And they had rationalized in a sort of just calculated way that it was easier for them to go and find what they needed externally and continue the relationship than it was to try and bring that piece into the relationship. And for women, women initiate, I think it's 70 to 80% of divorces, right? It's a very high rate. But women have, on average, affairs, and I've seen this to be true with the couples that I've worked with. They have affairs as a kind of like demarcation line of, I'm either right at the very precipice of leaving this relationship, or I've already crossed beyond that and I'm out. And so I think the why behind why we cheat also very much matters. And I think that needs to come into the equation, because, and again, that's not a universal law. It's a generality. It can be, switched. But for the most part, I've seen it to be true. And as I was talking about in my own personal experience, it's like, for the most part, I wasn't cheating because there was something wrong in the relationship, or that I didn't want to be with that person, or that I wanted to leave the relationship. I was having, extracurricular activities. I was cheating because there was something that I felt like I couldn't bring into the relationship. And so I was trying to maintain the relationship while having that need met externally. And so I think that that's quite common for a lot of men, where it's, it's like we want to continue, the family and make that through and just get by. And so we find this external thing, because I think that for a lot of men, when they enter into monogamy and when they enter into commitment, there is this kind of fierce dedication that I've seen a lot of men bring into that kind of commitment. It's like, well, I've given my word to this. And I felt that within myself when I, asked my wife to marry me and stepped into marriage. It's like, there's this fierce commitment of like, I think I was 35 or 36 at the time when I proposed. It's like, I lived 35 years and I'm entering into commitment for a very specific reason. And I'm going to do whatever it takes to make this work and to make this function. So I think that when we as men give our commitment to something, especially as something as serious as marriage, I think the majority of men truly at their core really want it to work, and they want it to succeed, and they want to win, and they want it to function. And so they'll do everything in their power to make that happen, even when that thing is dysfunctional, even when it's unhealthy. They'll deploy methods to try and stay in the relationship, to try and make it work, even if it's not a healthy way of being, and, cracks their integrity and et cetera.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You got a book, Men's Work. I really like your book.
Thank you.
Yeah. I really love the exercise. I think if a person went through and just did the prompts, asked those questions, if you even just didn't read the book and just did the prompts, it would be beyond worth it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
If you're actually just willing to do even probably a third of the prompts, it would be a big deal.
Yeah.
And it would be something that was, as I was reading, I was like, this would be really great to do in a relationship. It's geared towards men, but it's like, you could just replace it with,
I've had a lot of couples go through it together, actually.
Really great idea.
Yeah. Yeah, which has been, I think if I can just say one thing very briefly, is like, I think the therapeutic industry is doing men a disservice in a lot of ways, in the sense that there's a very feminized female approach of just like, let's get men to just feel good and to give them love and to give them validation.
Right.
And there's this sort of myth that like the cure all for our problems as men is to just be more vulnerable and open up.
No, we want to blow shit up.
Everything. Yeah.
We want purpose. We want to go.
Yeah, we want to be capable.
We want to protect.
Right?
I want an intruder to come in here right now so I can protect a girl. Like, that would be my freaking dream. A girl didn't want that. A girl didn't want an intruder to come to the house.
Right,
like,
right.
I'm like, literally, like, that's my, like, I think about it.
That's so good. Yeah, I mean, I do too. It's like, what would happen? When my wife and I moved into our new home, it's like off in the country, you know? And I was like, what would I do? You know, like, I think it was the second night that we were staying there. And I remember I had problems falling asleep because my mind was so active of like, what would I do if an intruder came in? And I have these axes in the house. And I was like, yeah, I'd definitely grab that axe.
Oh, yeah.
I'd fuck that guy up.
Dude, my bed is littered with weapons. I swear to God.
It's a funny thing. But anyway, I wanted to make
weapons and sex toys.
I wanted to make the book as tactical as possible. You know, it's just like go through and do the work. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. You also have your Instagram's great. ManTalk. Is that how you call it?
ManTalks. Yeah.
ManTalks.
Yeah.
What a great handle. What a great name.
Thank you.
Glad that exists.
Yeah. Thank you.
Need more men talking.
Yeah, I agree.
There's a term, male normative alexithymia. You ever heard that term?
I think it's like
up your alley.
Male inability to
express emotions.
Yeah.
It just like festers and then we like get in fights.
Yeah. That's pretty much it.
Yeah. Women bicker.
Yes.
But they don't fight so much.
Yeah.
Men hold in and then we fight.
Yeah. I got into a lot of bar fights for that exact reason in my late teens and early 20s.
I've never been a fighter.
Really?
No, not into it. I like organized fighting.
You'd probably do well.
Yeah, I'd be all right.
You know,
I've stopped fights.
See, I think I tried to stop fights every once in a while, but then it was a conceptual idea. I was like, I want to stop this fight. And then I was like, I want to stop this fight by beating the shit out of that guy. That sounds like a good idea.
No, I don't like violence. I don't want anybody to get hurt.
I see.
I want to suppress. Love organized fighting though.
Yeah.
Big fan. Pads, you know, rules, regulations.
I think it's because when I played hockey growing up, you know, two things. One, I eventually became the enforcer. And so I was the guy that was, you know, protecting the really skilled players when, you know, we'd play a team that was just brutal. And so I became the fighter. And secondly, I don't know if you guys did this, but we had this tradition, and maybe it's a Canadian thing, called helmets and gloves. You guys have that? So when somebody on your team fucked up, you would go after the game, you'd go back into the room and the guy that fucked up would have to just put on his helmet and his gloves and he'd have to fight one of the guys in the room for fucking up. And so it was like a test of sort of like reclamation, you know, like paying your dues for losing the game, but also just sort of like reproving yourself. I don't advocate for that. I don't think that that's necessarily the best way to go about it, but
called bipping, where you'd slap each other in the dick.
Yeah, right.
That was the closest thing.
We do stupid shit. You know, we really do.
We're animals.
We really do dumb shit.
It's terrible.
Listen, man, this has been phenomenal. And I feel like we had deep spiritual, relational conversations mixed with just broing out about as hard as we could. Yeah. Men's work, bro. We're doing it. Men's work, bro.
Yeah. Step by step.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Appreciate y'all for tuning in. That's it. That's all. See you next week. Hope you guys enjoyed that conversation. Thank you once again for subscribing to this so you get each week's episodes. Thank you for leaving us reviews. Thank you also for tuning into the Align Podcast YouTube channel, where we share new, fresh instructional content each week on how to support the health and movement of your body. Things like how to release your iliopsoas, how to regain functional mobility of your ankles, hips, shoulders, etc. If you got back pain, there is supportive content over there for you now. Jump over to the Align Podcast YouTube channel and subscribe, and I'll see you guys there.